Have you ever kept a secret for so long that it almost became part of who you are? Have you ever looked into someone's eyes, day after day, knowing something they could never imagine? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now might surprise you. I was young, innocent, one of those girls who believed that love was enough, that promises at the altar were sacred, and that fidelity was an unbreakable commitment. I got married thinking I'd found the man of my life, and for a while it seemed like I had. Flowers on birthdays, breakfast in bed on Sundays, kisses before bed, a life that, in everyone's eyes, was perfect. But, not everything is as it seems. It was one ordinary afternoon, while I was washing the children's clothes, that the truth slipped through the clean cloths of our routine. An envelope hidden between the pages of one of his books, which fell to the floor when our son ran across the room. Curious, I picked it up. I read it. It was a letter, but it wasn't for me. The words still echo in my head, even now, so many years later. I miss you. Those nights still burn into my skin. And the signature? Hers, the secretary. The one he always said was almost family. Yeah. Have you ever been there? That moment when the ground gives way beneath your feet, but you have to keep standing. Because there are children there, because there's dinner on the stove, because the neighbor might hear. I didn't cry that day, or the next, or in the years that followed. I kept it all inside, and I moved on. The funny thing is, no one ever suspected. We continued to be the neighborhood's example couple. He continued to bring me flowers, and I continued to smile in photos. But inside, I wilted a little more with each birthday, each anniversary he pretended to be special, when for me, it only reminded me of the betrayal hidden under the rug of our lives. For 30 years I carried this weight. 30 years. These weren't days of sorrow. They were decades of silence. And why did I never say anything? Maybe out of fear, maybe out of pride, or because back then a betrayed woman had no voice. It was easier to swallow the pain than face judgment. And I already had my own ghost to deal with. The kids, the house, the bills, the forced smiles at family dinners. But you see, time doesn't erase what we feel. It hides, it disguises. It piles the wounds one on top of the other, until one day the pile collapses. And when that happens, oh my dear, you're not the young girl you used to be. You've become a different woman. And I turned, not for revenge, but for justice, for me. Because there comes a time when we can no longer accept silence. Years later, when his hair was already white and his grandchildren were running around the same room where I found that letter, I discovered another. Not in the same way, nor from the same person. But the story repeated itself. Only this time, I was ready. Can you imagine what I did? This is the part no one expects. The part that might change everything you think about forgiveness, about loyalty, about the power of a woman who's been silent for too long. And that's why you need to hear this story until the end. Because sometimes the greatest act of courage is giving back what was once taken from you, but in your own way. Now, let me tell you how it all really started. And it was that day, looking out the kitchen window with the sun shining on the flowered curtains I'd sewn myself, that everything came flooding back, like a silent avalanche made of memories I'd tried to sweep under the rug, but which had always remained there, waiting for the right time to reappear. 30 years had passed. The house was the same. He still wore the same perfume. But I was no longer that woman with the submissive gaze and the wounded heart. And when I realized that history was about to repeat itself, again, with another woman, in a different situation, but with the same old lie, something inside me simply flipped. It was as if life gave me, without warning, the chance to listen to myself, to protect myself, to finally choose for myself. And as I tell you all this, I feel like I'm not alone. Because maybe on the other side of the screen, there's someone who's experienced something similar. A betrayal that doesn't bleed on the outside, but tears on the inside. A silence that screams. A difficult choice between keeping quiet or breaking free. If this topic resonates with you, leave your most moving comments below. Your story, your perspective, or even that outburst that's been bottled up inside for so long. This space here isn't just mine. It's ours. It's for those who carry hidden scars, for those who have survived pain and learned to reinvent themselves. And if this kind of story engages you, moves you, or even inspires you, like this video, It shows me and the world that this content has value. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content that we don't see with such sincerity. And if you feel like continuing to follow stories like this, real, raw, full of emotion and truth, subscribe to the channel, because what's still to come is powerful. Now take a deep breath with me, because what happened after that discovery was the beginning of everything I've waited my entire life to experience. Today, at 78, I look back with a clarity that only time can offer. It's not that the memories hurt less, they just hurt differently. They're like old scars that, from time to time, itch on rainy days. And even though I spent my entire life being that woman who smiled silently, who waited tables with a heavy heart and made it seem like everything was fine, today I no longer need to pretend. What made me keep all this bottled up for so long? The truth is, back then, the options a woman like me had were quite limited. You either accepted it or you accepted it. There was no talk of emotional health, no talk of respect within relationships like there is today. Women's pain was treated as exaggerated dramas, as something that could be solved with a hot bath or a prayer before bed. And I learned to survive in that environment. No manual, no support network, just the strength of a woman who knew she had to keep going, even while carrying a hidden truth within her chest. Can you imagine what it's like to live your entire life feeling like you're living behind the scenes of your own story? Because on the outside, the scene was one of a functional marriage, smiling children, Sunday barbecues, and a Christmas tree set up every December. But on the inside, the script was different. It was made of heavy silences, swallowed words, and choices made more out of fear than desire. I've become many things over the years: wife, mother, grandmother. I cared for everyone so zealously that sometimes I forgot to care for myself. And that's exactly why I'm telling this story now. It's not to cause a scene. It's not to point fingers or seek pity. It's because I reached a point where I understood that my journey matters too, that the pain we keep silent can transform into something more powerful than resentment. It can become courage. Because for me, it was this internal transformation that changed everything. It didn't happen overnight. There wasn't a day when I woke up and said, okay, now I'm strong. There were small bursts of light over the years, hurtful looks, repeated frustrations, the times I cried in the bathroom with the water running so no one could hear. All of this gradually built a new version of myself, more assertive, more alert, less willing to continue on autopilot. And you know what made me reflect the most? It was realizing the impact all of this had on the way I related to others. Because when you carry a wound for so long, it begins to shape your mindset without you even realizing it. You become suspicious of affection, diminish your own desires, and believe that accepting little is normal. And when I realized it wasn't just about what he did to me, but about what I allowed him to do to me, that's when the key turned. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there's a part of this story that few people know. It's not just about the betrayal itself, but what it revealed about everything around me. It was as if, after that first letter, I began to see things differently. I began to notice the gaps in the conversation, the gestures that had previously escaped me, the patterns repeating themselves, not just in him, but in myself as well. I realized how much we sometimes cling to the victim role as if it were a blanket on a cold night. It gives us comfort, justifies our decisions, masks our pain. But the truth is that living in this role, for so long, prevented me from making decisions that would have changed the course of my life. And admitting this hurts, because it's easier to blame others. It's simpler to say I was deceived than to acknowledge that, out of fear of change, I accepted what I knew was bad for me. This story is about betrayal, yes, but it's also about choices, about how we mold ourselves to what's offered to us, and how hard it is, later, to try to unmold ourselves. I was raised to serve, to please, to avoid confrontation, and this prevented me from being who I truly was. For a long time, my identity was shaped by the idea of being a good wife. But what does that mean after all? Being good to whom? I'm still figuring out some of these answers, even after all these years. And maybe you're on this quest too. Maybe there are things inside that have been bottled up for too long. And maybe, like me, you're feeling like it's time to let it all out. If this makes sense to you, write in the comments. I'm on this journey too, because even in such modern times, there are pains that are still experienced in silence, and perhaps, by sharing, we'll discover we're not so alone after all. When I met John, I still believed that love was enough to keep anything going. I was a country girl from a simple family, raised with those old-fashioned values we learn without even realizing it. Be good, be discreet, be chosen by a man, and build a life around him. I dreamed of marriage like someone who dreams of a fairy tale, and when he appeared, tall, handsome, with that crooked smile and a way of speaking that made us feel unique, I thought I'd won the lottery of life. He was my first everything. First love, first kiss, first certainty. The kind of man who knew what to say, who made you feel special, wanted, seen, and that, for a girl like me at the time, was like gold. I remember exactly the first time he held my hand. We were at a local fair. He bought me cotton candy and said he wanted to introduce me to his friends. In that moment, I felt like I'd been chosen, like someone had finally really looked at me. And that's where our vulnerability begins, right? When we give everything, believing the other person will care for us as we would. When we bet our self-esteem on someone, hoping they'll confirm to us every day that we matter. I was like that. I gave my heart without reservation. I dreamed of the house, the children, the trips we said we'd take when we got older. And he seemed to dream of me too, at least in the beginning. In the early years, everything was new and exciting. We had little money but a lot of passion. We decorated the apartment with used furniture, painted the living room walls light blue because he said it brought peace. And I believed him. I believed in every plan, every word, every promise. I dedicated myself as if loving were a profession, and he was the center of it all. But it's curious how, even in the happiest moments, something inside us senses something isn't right. Small gestures that go unnoticed, random phrases that seem insignificant, but leave a strange aftertaste. And yet, we ignore them. We want so much to believe we've found true love that we prefer to cover our eyes when faced with any sign of danger. At the time, I saw it as devotion. Today, I see it as a lack of self-esteem. Because when you don't know who you are, any love seems right. And I didn't know who I was. I was his wife. That was it. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because this kind of romanticization we learn from an early age has a profound impact on how we experience relationships. I grew up hearing that love required sacrifice, that marriage was a difficult journey, but that the woman was the foundation, that the man could make mistakes, but the woman had to hold everything together. And I took this literally. I became the foundation even when the house was already in ruins. I endured because I believed that was my role. And don't think it was just for him. I loved him, yes. But there's also a hidden fear there. Fear of being alone. Fear of being judged. Fear that everything I idealized would prove to be a lie. Because when you deposit your identity in a relationship, leaving it is like ripping your own skin off. John knew how to engage me. He knew the right gestures, the sweet words, the exact moment to make me laugh after making me cry. And I mistook this for love, but it was control. A subtle game of emotional manipulation that at the time I didn't have the tools to recognize. And the worst part is that this isn't an uncommon story. Many women spend years in relationships like this, convinced they're living a great love story, when, in reality, they're giving up themselves one little piece at a time. I only realized this much later, when the memories of the beginning were no longer enough to cover up the disappointments, when the gestures of affection became increasingly rare, and the silences began to speak too loudly. But in the beginning, he was everything I thought I needed. And I jumped in, like someone diving without knowing the depth of the well. Today I understand. I didn't just love him. I loved the idea I created about us, and that illusion is hard to let go of. It hurts. It's painful. Because it's not just about the other person. It's about letting go of the version of yourself that believed in that dream. And rebuilding that takes time. Sometimes it takes a lifetime. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If at some point in your history you also confused love with total surrender and realized too late the price this takes on us. 2 years into our marriage, I still believed I was experiencing a new beginning. I thought the difficult phase was over, that the adjustments to living together had already been made, and that what lay ahead was growth, complicity, and construction. We had already bought our first house, a small one, but ours. He was progressing at work, and I tended the household chores with zeal, like someone cultivating a garden, waiting for the flowers to bloom at the right time. But what blossomed then wasn't a flower. It was a thorn. It was an ordinary morning. One of those warm ones, when time passes slowly and the silence of the house seems comfortable. He'd left early. He said he had a meeting that would last until late, that he might not be back for lunch. I was going to take the opportunity to clean out the closets, reorganize the paperwork, those things we do when we want to get everything in order. And so, unintentionally, the truth fell into my lap. A forgotten envelope, folded in the middle of a book, was tucked into a cardboard box on top of the guest room closet. It was a poetry book I'd given him for our first wedding anniversary. When I opened the cover and saw the paper hidden inside, my body froze. At first I didn't understand. It was a different handwriting than mine, feminine, drawn, with hearts for exclamation points. And as I read, each word seemed to tear me apart. I think about you all the time. That night, the way you touched me still gives me goosebumps. I want more, even if we have to keep it a secret. I stopped reading before the end. I didn't need to. I already understood everything. In that moment, I didn't cry. My body didn't move. I stood still, paper in hand, as if there was still a chance it was a lie. But it wasn't. The signature at the bottom hit me with the confirmation I'd feared. It was his secretary's. That same woman he'd said was very helpful, who was efficient, who had marital problems and needed support. In that moment, I discovered what it was like to feel the world go up in smoke around you. I didn't scream, I didn't call him, I didn't make a fuss. I just put the paper back in the book, closed the box, and shoved everything back up into the closet. But inside me something had crumbled, and the worst part was, no one saw it, not even him. When he came home at the end of the day, he kissed me on the forehead and asked what was for dinner. And I answered, like I always did. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what happens to a woman after she discovers someone's betrayal isn't just a crisis in the relationship, it's a crack in her very identity. You start to wonder, where did I fail? Why wasn't I enough? Was I ever too blind, naive, weak? But the hidden truth no one talks about is that betrayal is never just about physical fidelity. It affects trust, the perception of security, the sense of truth. And the impact this has on our mentality is devastating. I became a different person after that day. Not overnight, but gradually. I became quieter, more withdrawn, more suspicious. And yet, I stayed there, cooking, cleaning, caring, smiling at the neighbors, because I didn't know how to leave. I didn't even know if could to go out. Back then, being cheated on was almost treated as part of the package. How many women I heard say, men are just like that. Better not stir up the hornet's nest, pretend you didn't see, and peace continues. And deep down, that's exactly what we do. Pretend. Pretend we didn't see, that we don't know, that it doesn't hurt, but deep down, we're transforming. And it's not a pretty transformation. It's silent, heavy, full of decisions we make not because we want to, but because we feel we have no alternative. And yet, I continued to love, or I thought I did, because it's hard to separate true love from the attachment to the idea that everything can still go back to the way it was. I clung to the memory of that girl in love at the fair, the first kiss, the promises exchanged on the balcony. It was as if, by accepting the betrayal, I was also trying to save that version of myself, the woman who believed, the woman who trusted. But deep down, something inside me already knew. Nothing would be the same again. Comment here. That makes sense to me, if you've also experienced that moment when a truth changes everything, but the world around you remains the same, as if nothing had happened. Back then, a betrayed woman didn't scream. She didn't leave the house. She didn't slam the door. She didn't make a scene. She remained silent. She swallowed her tears, fixed her hair, served dinner, and smiled in the family portrait as if nothing had happened. And that's exactly what I did. I kept quiet. But silence, for someone carrying such pain, is not peace. It's prison. I had 2 small children. One was 3 years old, the other just 7 months old. Babies who needed all of me, even when I was broken. The house was simple, the budget tight. John was the only one who worked outside the home, the one who supported us, and even though I wanted to scream, leave, disappear, I knew I couldn't. Because at that stage in my life, I wasn't just a woman, I was a mother. And for them, I would endure anything. But don't fool yourself into thinking this was strength. Not at that moment. It was fear. Fear of having nowhere to go. Fear of not being able to support my children. Fear of judgment from family, church, and neighborhood. Because a woman who abandons her home because of an affair was still seen as unbalanced, impulsive, even ungrateful. His mistake could be forgiven. My reaction couldn't, so I stayed there. I made coffee the next day, changed diapers, cleaned the house, and didn't say a word about the letter. He never knew I knew, or if he did, he never asked. And therein lies one of the cruelest truths of living together. Sometimes, silence is so convenient, it becomes complicity. I became an accomplice to betrayal by choosing silence. And for a long time, I hated that about myself. But today, I understand the context. My generation was taught to swallow what hurt. We were trained to endure. We grew up hearing our mothers say, "Men make mistakes, women support them. It's better to have a bad husband than to raise children alone. Don't wash your dirty laundry in public." And even the strongest of us ended up giving in to this rhetoric, because no one taught us we had a choice. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what impacted me most wasn't just the betrayal, but what it revealed about myself, about how I stopped listening to myself, looking at myself, defending myself. I set aside everything I felt, everything I needed, to keep something going that, deep down, had already crumbled. And this has a huge impact on how we continue to live. When you suppress your own pain, you start to get used to the little, and the little becomes the rule. It becomes routine. For years, I played the role of exemplary wife. I fulfilled everything expected of me. The table was always set, the house was always clean, the children were well dressed, but inside, it was as if I'd put myself on automatic mode. Each day was a repetition of the last. I stopped asking questions, stopped questioning, even stopped dreaming. I lived behind the scenes of my own story, just observing, as if I no longer had a right to the stage. And over time, I realized that the greatest damage of that betrayal wasn't what he did. It was what I stopped doing for myself. I stopped taking care of myself, admiring myself, treating myself with love. I gradually forgot myself. First, I stopped dressing up, then going out, then laughing. I began to believe that that faded version of myself was the best I could be, and that, for me, was the true loss. But something remained. Even buried under so much emotional dust, there was a part of me that didn't forget, that kept it, that recorded every detail of that paper, every word, every sentence. It was like a quiet voice inside, reminding me, this wasn't right, this can't go unnoticed. And that voice never died. It stayed there, waiting for the right moment, the right strength, the right maturity. Because sometimes we don't react right away, not because we're weak, but because we don't yet have the strength to face what comes with that reaction. And that's a decision too. Staying silent was my way of surviving at that moment. And sometimes surviving is all we can do. But surviving isn't the same as living, and it took me years to understand the difference. Comment here. I'm on this journey too. If you have ever swallowed some pain because you thought you couldn't do anything different, but deep down, a part of you knew that it needed to change, life went on. Or so it seemed. After the discovery, after the shock, after everything I'd kept to myself, the routine resumed its course as if nothing had happened. We'd wake up early, he'd have coffee reading the newspaper, the boys would play in the backyard, and I'd wash the dishes with the radio on. In the eyes of others, we were the perfect family. A close-knit couple, healthy children, a tidy house, birthday parties filled with cake and neighbors. But inside, something inside me was always on alert. It was as if I lived in an emotional minefield where any small gesture from him could reactivate that memory. An exaggerated compliment, a distracted glance, a phone call after 9 o'clock at night. I smiled in photos, yes. I fixed my hair, chose a pretty dress, said cheese with all my teeth showing. But the smile was a mask, carefully placed, because every time I looked into his eyes, that letter pierced me again. At first, I tried to convince myself that time would fade, that the betrayal had been just an isolated mistake, something from the past, overcome. He never mentioned it, never confessed. He continued living as if nothing had been violated, as if everything between us was still the same. And maybe it would have been easier if he had confessed, if he had apologized, given me the chance to truly react. But his silence was the cruelest confirmation, because somehow he knew I knew. And yet, you chose to pretend. This invisible pact, to keep up appearances, became our way of life. We traveled, we had picnics, we decorated the Christmas tree with the boys. And there were moments when, for a second, I almost believed it was all normal. But all it took was for him to touch me in a different way, or mention the name of someone I didn't know, and it all came flooding back. My stomach churned. My memory insisted on reliving every word of that letter, as if it had been written yesterday. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because living in constant disguise has a cost. Our minds begin to fragment, creating versions of ourselves that behave according to their surroundings. There was the woman who laughed at family parties, the devoted mother who made lunch for school, the wife who straightened his collar before leaving. And hidden within all of these was a wounded, suspicious, exhausted woman who only emerged when the house slept. This emotional duplicity affects everything: the way you see yourself, how you react to situations, how you relate to others. I became tougher, more practical, less tolerant of small flaws, not because I wanted to, but because, to maintain my outward balance, I needed to be in control of everything else. While the surface was calm, my interior was a pure hurricane. And the worst part is, no one saw it. People praised our marriage. They said they wished they had what we had. And every time I heard that, a lump formed in my throat. Because what they saw was the facade. They didn't know the truth hidden behind the scenes. And for a while, I fed this social lie because it was self-protection. It was easier to stick to the script than to open the wound in front of an audience. But maintaining all of this requires a kind of strength that isn't sustainable. As the years passed, I felt increasingly distant from myself. It was as if I lived on the surface of life, unable to dive in. The parties continued. Christmases came and went. The children's birthdays became photo albums. But I no longer saw myself in them. And it's not that I stopped loving. The love, or what was left of it, still lingered there, but mixed with hurt, distrust, and a silent weariness. Sometimes I'd look at him sleeping and wonder, does he think about this? Does he regret it? Or does he just forget? And this constant doubt was what ate away at me the most, because the pain we know, we learn to face. But the absence of truth, the emptiness where there should be regret, that sickens me inside. Still, I kept going. I played the role life gave me, or the one I accepted out of fear of tearing the plot. Until, years later, a new situation brought it all back. And then I knew I couldn't keep pretending any longer. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. If you've ever experienced this contrast between what the world sees and what only you feel. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't hiding it. It's continuing to carry alone what no one notices. Time passed like someone trying to sweep everything under the rug. Years turned into decades. The boys grew up, each going their own way. I watched their childhood unfold through the hallways of that same house where the betrayal had been hidden. And ironically, or perhaps by fate, it was there that I also became a grandmother. I remember the first time I held my granddaughter in my arms. Such a small being, so young, so full of life. And at the same time, I felt the weight of everything I'd been carrying, as if time had left too many marks inside. I looked at that little creature and thought, what will this girl learn about love, about trust, about what to accept and what not to accept? Because deep down, we carry these emotional legacies even without realizing it. I knew that many of the things I chose to keep silent didn't end with me. And this awareness haunted me for a long time, because even though I was a present mother, a constant wife, a caregiver to everything and everyone, I wasn't whole, not as I could have been. And he grew older too. He became calmer, more dependent, even more sentimental. At times I wondered, does he remember? Does he regret it? Or could it all be buried in his mind, along with the old furniture we traded, the letters we never wrote again, the kisses that became increasingly rare? Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when we talk about hurt, many people think of something intense, violent, with crying and screaming. But the most dangerous hurt is the one that slowly creeps in, taking up space in the empty spaces of our routine. It lives in the silence of nights when no one talks, in the automatic good morning, in the touch that is no longer affection, but habit, and above all, in the lack of listening, because being ignored hurts more than being insulted. The hurt grew old with me, but it didn't die, and I could see it in the small reactions I had. The times he told me he loved me, and I smiled in disbelief. The times he seemed to be trying, and yet I kept my guard up. Not because I wanted to live in distrust, but because that was where I protected myself. It was my way of not bleeding again. With the grandchildren running around the living room, the house filled with laughter and the smell of cooking, everything seemed so beautiful from the outside. And in part, it was. I experienced real joy. I was happy in many moments. I don't want to paint my life with only dark tones, but in every family portrait, there was a shadow. An absence of something that could have been. A crack no one saw, but that made everything inside me tremble when it came to trust. The hidden truth is that time doesn't heal what isn't faced. Time teaches us to disguise, to manage, to rearrange the pieces of the puzzle, but the broken piece remains there, and, every now and then, it reappears. That's what I felt. Every time he held my hand at a birthday dinner, every time he thanked me for being with him after so many years, behind that gratitude, there was guilt disguised as gratitude, and I felt it. Grief, contrary to what many people think, doesn't require anger to exist. It can be peaceful, silent. It can come with a seemingly good life. It can walk hand in hand with routine and still slowly corrode our soul. And that's how it lived with me. Like an unwanted guest I never kicked out, but also never fully accepted. And you know what's strangest? At some point, I started to wonder if he even remembered the letter. If it had been a slip of the tongue for him, or if it had been a way of life. I never knew. And perhaps that's the cruelest part of this whole story. Living alongside someone for so many years, sharing a roof, a table, and a bed, and still having questions that were never answered. But I kept going. I kept going because it was what I knew how to do. Because at that time, keeping the family together seemed more important than seeking emotional justice. Because there was love, yes, but a love marked, transformed, reconfigured after the pain. Comment here. That makes sense to me if you've ever found yourself smiling on the outside, but carrying something inside that was never actually said out loud. Life has a curious way of testing us when we least expect it. I thought I'd been through it all, that old dormant hurt would never resurface so vividly. I'd grown accustomed to the idea that some answers would never come, that certain feelings would remain bottled up until the end. But then, 3 decades after that first letter, something happened, and everything I'd buried so deeply began to stir within. It was an ordinary afternoon. We were retired, living that quiet phase when grandchildren bring more noise than our own children. He attended church every week, participated in prayer groups, helped with the choir. Nothing about him seemed suspicious, but one small action set off a red flag in me. He left his unlocked phone on the table, and it wasn't something he usually did. A message flashed on the screen, and I swear my heart pounded like it did 30 years ago. A female name. A thank you for talking yesterday. It was special for me. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to become that suspicious woman again. But my instinct, the one that had been sleeping quietly for so long, shook me. I picked up my phone with trembling hands, and there they were. Several exchanges of messages with a woman from church, conversations that started innocently but, over time, became too intimate. There were compliments, there were innuendos, there was too much emotion for someone who claimed to have already experienced everything she needed. And in that moment, something inside me didn't break, quite the opposite. Something aligned, because I was no longer the same woman I'd been 30 years ago. I was no longer trapped by the same circumstances, no longer held hostage by fear, insecurity, or emotional dependence. I knew what I had lived through. I knew what I had endured. And more than that, I knew who I had become. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there's a huge difference between acting out of pain and acting out of conscience. Back when I was first betrayed, I silenced myself for survival. Now, I no longer needed to survive. I could choose, and it was this sense of choice that gave me a powerful calm. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to scream or expose or drag a dirty story onto the family table. I just wanted him to know that I knew, and that, this time, I was in control of the narrative. That's when I thought of the letter. That old letter which transformed me without him even realizing it. I remembered every word, the yellowed paper, the weight it had on my life, so I decided to return it. Not in the same way, but with the same impact. I took a simple sheet of paper, sat at the table, and wrote calmly. Now we are two who keep secrets, but I'm no longer afraid of silence, because today it speaks for me. I left the letter folded on his pillow, like one would leave a regular note. I went to make coffee. I didn't wait for a reaction. I didn't watch. I didn't need a response. Because what I wanted was for him to feel, for the first time, what it's like to live with a hidden truth throbbing inside him. The greatest transformation wasn't what he felt while reading. It was what I felt while writing. It was as if, for the first time, I had managed to escape the story that had trapped me. As if finally I had closed the cycle that had been open for 3 decades. Not with scandal, not with pain, but with determination. Because there are moments when we don't need an audience, nor confirmation. All that's needed is the calm certainty that, after all, we've come to our senses. And he read it. I know that. He came back from the room with a look of surprise and guilt, but he didn't say anything. Neither did I. It was as if, there in that silence, an agreement had been reached. The truth was out in the open. It no longer needed to be said, only understood. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you've ever felt that, at some point in your journey, the best answer was simply to show that you knew, and that you no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. There was no shouting, no fighting, not even a single word spoken, and yet, it was the most powerful moment I've ever experienced with him. The letter was there, carefully folded, resting on the living room table like an ordinary object, but it carried the weight of a lifetime I'd endured in silence. It was written with the same calm you'd use to fold a clean sheet after a hard day. No fury, no irony, no vengeful tone, just the truth, mine. I used simple, direct, and unadorned words. I wanted him to understand without any room for excuses. And at the same time, I wanted him to feel what it's like to be struck by a revelation that doesn't need a loud voice to shake everything inside. I didn't describe the messages I saw. I didn't talk about the other woman or demand an explanation. I simply made it clear that I knew, and that this time, I wouldn't be the one to bear the weight of the omission. He took a while to come in. When he read it, he didn't immediately seek me out. He remained silent, as I had been so many years ago. The irony of the situation is that after all this time, he was the one who didn't know how to react. And me? I just watched. Not with pleasure, but with serenity. Because there is a kind of justice that doesn't need to be proclaimed. It happens the very moment the truth imposes itself, firm and inevitable. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because many people think that getting even means stooping to someone else's level, that it's demeaning yourself. But what I did wasn't to equalize myself. It was to free myself. It wasn't for him. It was for me. Because the truth is, for years, I let him believe he'd won that story, that his betrayal went unpunished, that I accepted it. But accepting and enduring are different things. And in that moment, by writing that letter, I broke the cycle. Without scandal, without an audience, without having to step outside myself, silent justice is the one that hurts the most. Because it doesn't come with discussion, it doesn't give a chance to defend oneself. It simply imposes itself. And seeing him walk around the house quieter than usual, more hesitant in his gestures, more careful with his words, was the answer I didn't even know I expected. He understood, and I understood too. I didn't need forgiveness, not from him, not from me. I just needed to see that I was still alive inside. You know, there's something about maturity that completely changes the way we deal with what hurts us. When we're younger, we want to resolve everything with intensity, to scream, to confront, to expose. But with time, we discover that true power lies in a clear conscience, in a thoughtful decision, in a firm gesture that doesn't require anyone's approval. I've never felt stronger than I did that day. And it wasn't because I hurt. It was because I finally protected myself. For many years, I wondered, what if I had acted differently back in the beginning? What if I had stood up to him, left home, yelled at him? Maybe my life would have taken a different path. Yes, but maybe I also wasn't prepared. Sometimes life presents certain opportunities when we have the emotional structure to deal with what comes next. And that's what happened to me. I was no longer a girl in love. I was a whole woman. A woman who knew what she was worth, what she deserved, and most importantly, what she would no longer accept. The letter didn't change the past, but it changed the way I look at it. And more than that, it changed the way I look at myself. I stopped carrying guilt, stopped wondering if I'd done too little, if I'd given too much. Because in that moment I realized I'd never been weak. I'd been strong all along. Strong for not giving up on my children, for keeping a family together even in the face of pain, for moving forward even with my soul in pieces. And now, I was also strong for taking a stand. After the letter, he never mentioned anything again, but his behavior changed. His gestures became more restrained, his gaze more careful, as if suddenly he had seen the woman who had always been there, but whom he had ignored. And while this change doesn't erase everything, it leaves a trail of respect, perhaps late, perhaps silent, but real. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you've ever experienced the kind of change that doesn't require fuss, just courage. Because sometimes, all it takes is the right gesture at the right time to change your entire life. He held the letter for a few seconds, as if unsure whether to reveal a secret or leave the envelope sealed forever. He sat slowly in the living room chair, his eyes fixed on the paper. His breathing was heavy, as if the air there had gained a new density. I remained in the kitchen, pretending to be busy with simple things, washing a cup, cutting a loaf of bread, stirring the cold coffee. But my entire body was attentive. I knew his every gesture, every tick. I knew that, in that silence, there were more words than in any conversation we'd ever had. When he finally opened it, it didn't take long for the weight of those few sentences to settle on his face. His jaw clenched, his neck stiffened, and his eyes, always so expressive, too expressive sometimes, began to move restlessly, as if searching for some explanation between the lines. He looked at me. He said nothing, but I saw it. I saw fear, not fear of myself, but fear of what that letter revealed about him. The kind of fear that only appears when the mask falls and the truth is no longer a choice. I also saw shame, the same shame he might have felt 30 years earlier, but never had the courage to show. The shame of having done it, of having been seen, of having no way back. And for a brief moment, I saw something that might have been a plea for forgiveness, not in words, but in that trembling gaze that held breath, that hesitant way he folded the paper back, as if unsure where to put it now. He put the letter aside, got up slowly, and walked to his room. He didn't say a word, and strangely, it didn't bother me. For the first time in years, the silence between us didn't hurt, because he was no longer a cold wall. He was the reflection of everything he could no longer hide. And I didn't need an explanation, because the greatest revelation was already there, explicit in his bewilderment. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there are situations in life where the answer we expect will never come in the form of an apology. It will never come with a pretty speech or theatrical regret. It will come through a change in atmosphere, the way the other person looks at you after truly seeing you, the visible discomfort that betrays the impact of what was said. And there, in that moment when he withdrew, it was as if, suddenly, he understood everything. The weight of my pain, the extent of the silence, the strength contained in that decision not to scream, not to come out, to simply show. In the days that followed, there were no grand gestures, no declarations, no attempts at a forced fresh start. But there was a different caution in the air. His steps around the house became softer, his voice lower. He began to observe me in a new way, as if discovering a woman who had always been there, but whom he had never truly seen. And that, for me, was enough. Not because it erases the past, but because, for the first time, I felt he recognized the woman he'd had by his side all this time. And that's no small feat. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't making the other person apologize. It's making them realize the damage done. It's provoking a kind of reflection that isn't always verbalized, but that reveals itself in behavior, in the way they begin to act with more delicacy, more presence, more awareness of the cost of that moment. I don't want to paint this episode as a happy ending, because real life isn't a romantic script. Real life is made of layers, nuances, and unspoken stories. But there, in that moment, when he read my letter and looked at me that way, something between us reorganized. not to return to how it was, but to finally acknowledge everything we'd experienced, and everything we'd lost too. Because what happened wasn't just between him and that woman from church, nor between him and the woman from the letter 30 years ago. It was between him and himself, and between me and my own story. It was a silent reckoning with everything that had been building up between us for so long. And sometimes that's all we need, to be acknowledged, to have our pain seen, to have our silence understood. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you've ever had that moment when it wasn't the words, but the other person's gaze that finally showed you that they understood what you've been carrying inside your entire life. I didn't write that letter to hurt him, nor did I expect him to suffer the way I had so many years ago, because what I needed wasn't revenge, it was release. It was to lift from within me the weight of having swallowed it for too long, of having walked beside him for 3 decades with a pain that was never acknowledged, a story that was never spoken aloud. I needed to show, with that simple piece of paper, that the wound existed, that it bled, that it was never imaginary, and it was only after I showed him, it was only after he looked at me that way, wordless but full of meaning, that I realized how much I needed that. Not him, that gesture, the breaking of the silence, because sometimes healing doesn't come from the conversation that never happened. It comes from the action you take when you decide you're no longer going to hide the pain as if it were your mistake. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because we spend a good part of our lives trying to keep up appearances, trying to protect others from the truth, as if it were our duty to keep everything running smoothly even when it's falling apart inside. I did this for a long time. I kept quiet, thinking I was protecting my children, my family, the image of a marriage that seemed like an example to everyone. But in reality, I was neglecting myself, every day, a little bit. And there's nothing lonelier than watching the world applaud you for a life that, deep down, doesn't reflect who you really are or what you truly feel. The hidden truth is that most people live like this, smiling on the outside, waiting for the right moment to finally be truly seen. And I waited for that moment for years, until I realized it wouldn't come from outside. It would have to come from within. When I left that letter, it wasn't to instill guilt. It was to return to him, with the same gentleness I never received, the awareness of what he had done. I didn't want to scream. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted him to know that I knew. And most importantly, that I no longer carried it as a secret. It was my story too, and I had every right to bring it to light, even after so long. That seemingly simple action stirred internal structures I hadn't even realized were still fragile. I felt a strange peace, a lightness that only comes when we make peace with our own history. For the first time in a long time, I slept feeling whole. Not perfect, not restored, but honest with myself. And that, for me, was true healing. Of course, the relationship didn't go back to how it was, and it shouldn't have, because some things can't be undone. They have a continuation, and this continuation only happens when both understand that they need to rebuild with the pieces that remain. And the pieces were there, scattered from so many years of silence, of unspoken hurts, of absences disguised as routine. They don't stick together with hot glue or new promises. They settle into a different way, more cautious, more sincere. The beautiful thing is that, from that moment on, even without long conversations, I saw changes, small but consistent, and I knew the letter had done what it needed to do. Not by magic, but because, when we take a stand with truth, the impact is inevitable. Transformation begins within, and it radiates, first in the writer, then in the reader. If you've made it this far, you may have felt something similar at some point in your life. Perhaps you carried a pain, a disappointment, a lack of recognition that only you know how heavy it was. Perhaps you still do. And if that's the case, I want to tell you in all honesty that there is a way to free yourself from this without having to break everything around you. Sometimes, a symbolic act is enough, a gesture that says, I saw what you did and I haven't been the same since. And it's not about the other person understanding. It's about you no longer keeping quiet about yourself. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you also believe that, more than being forgiven or forgiving, we need to be heard. Because there are wounds that only heal when they are finally recognized as real. If you've stayed with me this far, It's because this story somehow touched something deep inside, and knowing that gives me the certainty that it was worth opening my heart. We go through so much in silence, and when we find a space to acknowledge ourselves, to listen to ourselves more truly, that is incredibly valuable. If this content made sense to you, if it brought you reflection, relief, or even courage, leave a comment below with the phrase, "This message was for me. I will love knowing that you were with me until the end of this journey." And if stories like this resonate with you, if you want to continue immersing yourself in sincere, profound, and real-life conversations, subscribe to the channel. This space is made for that, for those seeking connection, not perfection. Oh, and if this video really touched you, leave a like here. It's a way to keep this circle of listening and sharing going. We never know who might also find themselves in these words. There's a video here that complements everything we discussed. Click and continue with me there. The conversation isn't over yet.